Now let's take a look at the first right of refusal contingency addendum and the contingency removal or release agreement. A first right of refusal contingency addendum is typically going to come from the listing side as part of a counteroffer when the buyer has written into the contingency section of the purchase agreement that the sale is contingent upon the successful sale and settlement of the buyer's property. When that happens, the seller may not want to fully remove their home from the market, waiting for the buyer's contingency home to get through all its inspections and all of those sort of things. So they will then, the seller's side will then return this document filled out such that the listing will remain active in the MLS, showing that there is a first right of refusal on the property. What that means is the seller can go ahead and show the property and entertain other offers. Should another offer come in that the seller feels is comparable or acceptable, then they would give notice to the buyer based on this document. So let's go through this document and then we'll go through how that notice works and what happens with that. So the first right of refusal contingency addendum, as always, matches the top of the purchase agreement with the date, buyer, seller, listing firm, selling firm, and the full property address. Then the buyer's contingencies are listed, and the contingency typically is contingent on successful sale and settlement of the buyer's property located at blank. And then it would state whether the property is currently listed or is under contract and may be scheduled to close, all of that. Then the contingencies shall remain in effect until a certain date. And that date could be the date that the PICRA contingency ends. It could be the actual closing date of their property if you're purchasing this one to close, say, a couple weeks later. Whatever that date is what you're going to put here. Then the seller is going to put a timeline on the buyer's response should the seller get an additional offer and want to move on it. It's typically 2 or 3 days for the buyer to remove the contingency and move forward, or terminate the agreement and allow the seller to move on with the new contract. And it can be written as 48 hours or 72 hours or 2 days or 3 days. The form is already spelled out for days. So typically it's going to be 2, maybe 3 days. 2 is more common. So be prepared to only have 2 days to respond to the notification that the seller has another contract they'd like to work with. And you're going to have to provide the seller whatever they list here. For example, they may want a proof of a ratified PICRA removing the inspection contingency. Whatever everybody agrees on is proper proof, and that's for the parties to decide. So within that time frame, that is provided, and the buyer decides whether they want to move ahead by removing the contingency or if they're going to have to terminate the contract. If once this is sent by the seller, everybody needs to sign this, and everybody needs to sign this and get it integrated into part of the agreement. Now, if this says, if prior to the expiration of the response period, the buyer does not remove the contingency in writing and buyer is unable to provide acceptable written evidence of buyer's ability to perform according to the terms of the agreement, then the agreement shall be terminated and all parties agree to execute the release agreement and release the deposit to the buyer. Okay. So once this becomes part of the contract. Buyer continues to do whatever they need to do to get their contingency satisfied so they can remove this contingency from their follow-on purchase. If the seller receives another contract, then this form, the first right of refusal notice, contingency removal, and release agreement form is going to be given to the buyer. Again, everything is going to match the top of the purchase agreement. And then it says the purpose of this statement is to notify the buyer that the seller has received an acceptable purchase agreement on the property. Therefore, in accordance with the purchase agreement, the buyer has, and this is going to be the 2 days as is listed over here, after the receipt of this notice, to remove the following contingencies. So whatever contingency you've written on this form, you're going to see on this form. Okay. So then you have two options. You have option A, if the buyer is removing the contingency and moving forward with the purchase. Okay. And this is going to be from the other contingency section 14E at the top of page 10 of the purchase agreement and whatever's listed here. And then the date the form is signed by the buyers is the effective date that the contingency is removed. And this becomes then a pending purchase agreement. There are no more contingencies. Okay, so all the buyer's protections are gone at this point. And if the buyer's satisfied with that, great, you're all good, move forward. If not, option B is where you're going to go. This looks just like the release agreement when we terminate the contract under the PICRA and any other cancellation of the contract. So if the buyer cannot remove the contingency and move forward, if the lender says, no, you have to be closed on that purchase before you can purchase this property, and there are questions going on with that purchase, then you don't want to put your client in a position of having to own two properties if that's not something that they can do. So buyer acknowledges the buyer is unable to perform in accordance with the purchase agreement, and therefore the buyer and seller agree to the following release terms. Typically, it's the full amount of the earnest money, who's holding it, the escrow agent. The amount for disbursement is typically the full earnest money amount to the buyer's names and the amount again. And this section is the same as a regular release agreement. Fill out every section as pertains to the transaction. And then it continues on to the next page. The address for disbursement of the escrow, you're going to put the buyer's full mailing address for the return of the earnest money, or state that the escrow agent will continue to hold the earnest money for a follow-on purchase. That must be stated in writing so that the escrow agent has their checks and balances for tracking the money. All right. And then all parties sign at the bottom, regardless of whether you have chosen option A or option B. Okay. This is another one of those things that can get a little complicated. So if you need help, don't hesitate to reach out to one of the mentors or reach out to me, and we will help you get it situated so that you can move forward with your client.